I just want to welcome up Chris from MilKEEP. These guys they created some pretty incredible stuff that saved me probably 3 weeks of frustration they caught me halfway as I was typing in my 12 years of Air Force flight records that were completely just scanned pieces of garbage. And so I was hand jamming that thing into an Excel spreadsheet, and about halfway through that, I don't even remember how we got connected and started talking about it, but what MilKEEP is doing right now is absolutely incredible from a time saving and accuracy perspective. So if you have any interest in having a logbook from your HARM records, and I know Army and Navy is a little bit different, and I'll let Chris talk to that. This is pretty awesome stuff.
Okay, hey everybody, my name is Chris Euland. I'm from Team MilKEEP, and today we're going to be talking about a completely uncontentious topic that is very well known and no one has a problem with. So yesterday, we got the agenda and we saw that I was the guy on directly after lunch, and I was like, this is probably the worst idea ever for a full belly and talk about logbooks. So luckily we shifted a little bit, and away we go. Slide, please. So you'll have to forgive me, I just transitioned from active duty about 2 weeks ago, so I still have the standard agenda slide that will cover everything that's going to happen, but I'd like this to be more of a just open discussion. So I don't want it to be gimmicky in terms of here's what MilKEEP is going to present to you. This is just going to be an overview discussion of logbooks in general. And if we get into really specifics of, hey, this was my very specific logbook and I've flown 12 planes and this is, what happened in this, we can certainly talk about that. Trying to do it off the cuff. I'd have to see your very specific instance because logbooks are a very personal thing. But what we are going to talk about, I'll go over, regardless of the service that you're in, the different regulations that you care about in the military, and then the overarching one for the civilian world. Everyone has had questions already about how to calculate PIC and what I should or should not consider pilot and command time, so we'll go over that. We'll break out into the different services. This I saw based on hands was very Air Force centric, so I think the first couple of slides are Air Force, and then we'll break out into Army and Navy quickly, just so you all have a broad understanding of the differences for all the services. And then what I think everyone really cares about, pilotcredentials.com, airlineapps.com, the differences between the two, because they are fairly different in terms of how you're going to log and show your times. Slide forward, please. Okay, source material. So Air Force, in terms of logging time for your Air Force career, the primary time, secondary time, other time, definitions for all that is inside of the AFI, Air Force Instruction 11401. Navy and Army obviously needed three sets of regulations because they're 3 times the size of everybody else. But those are where all your definitions for your different times are gonna live. So Air Force uses a system called ARMS database, and they also use a couple different ones now, GTIMS. Navy uses SHARP, which is the Sierra Hotel Air Force Resource Program, and then Army uses something called CAFRS, which I don't know the acronym. Any of the Army guys, you remember what CAFRS is? Yeah, no, I've asked like 10 Army guys, like, I don't know, it's CAFRS. But the most important one, the one that you really care about, is from the Code of Federal Regulations, so 14 CFR, section 61.51, and that is the section that talks about logging pilot time. So that's your physical definitions for pilot in command time, second in command time, and what you have to have in order to log that specific type of time. So, slide, please. All right, pilot in command, which is what everybody cares about, because in the Air Force you get primary, secondary, IP, EP, other time, and we're all used to, for 15 or 20 years of our service, based on what the 11401 said, all of them have to add up to a very specific total, and it can't deviate from that. All 5 of those things have to equal your total time. When you're talking about pilot in command for the 14 CFR, there's 4 real requirements where you have an instance where you can log pilot in command time. So if you're the sole manipulator of the controls of an aircraft in which you're certified and rated, if you're the sole occupant of the aircraft, obviously, if you're acting as the pilot in command, basically, and you're the one who signs for the jet, which is what Mike and Jess were talking about, right? And then there's the other caveat, I was acting in pilot in command, but somebody else was really the pilot in command, and we were both certified in order to do it, and da-da-da-da. So that's another way that you can legally log it, but really, bottom line, what the airlines are most interested in is, were you the one that signed for the aircraft? In the Air Force, it's where you the A code, right? And did you sign on the orders and take responsibility for all safe conduct of that aircraft during that flight? So the two starred ones there, sole occupant in the aircraft, obviously the one that is going to be in charge of the safe conduct of the aircraft. And then section 3, which is when you've actually signed for the orders. Those are the ones we're going to focus on the most in terms of what you do. So slide. All right, Air Force specifics. So this is a cut and paste from a flight record, one that we've done. And you can see that inside of your individual flight record report from the ARM system, it'll have a breakout with a duty position. So this one was evaluator pilot, instructor pilot, and there's a co-pilot time in there. But it doesn't physically say if you were the A code or not. I know someone opened up and said, well, sometimes we throw multiple instructors on an aircraft. How do we know if you're the actual instructor or not for that, or the A code for that? So what most people do is they look at the aircraft certification date when they became an aircraft commander. For most crewed aircraft, aircraft with a crew, that is from the time that you're an MP or above, so FP time, which is first pilot, unqualified pilot, and student pilot. Those are kind of before your AC cert date. It'll take anything after that, and they'll bundle it up and they'll say, I'm going to take, we've heard 80%, 90%, right? What I would say to you is if you're a more high-time pilot, I would go tend to the lower percentage if it still looks like you're inside of the minimums and the preferred times. Use the lower percentage and say, hey, I was more conservative towards this. Even with 80%, I hit these numbers. That's our recommendation to you. So I think that hits everything in this slide. And then we'll get into another big question that we have, which is the difference between Air Force secondary time, which looks to be SEC on your 781 that you log, and then SIC time, which is a CFR definition for second in command time. So you can see there's similarities, and I underlined them. Basically, both of them you have to be sitting at a set of flight controls, right? Pretty important for that. Big difference in second in command time for the civilian side is it's supposed to be for an aircraft that requires more than one pilot. So when you go back and say, all right, I'm going to take an 80% or 90% of my total time, I'm going to call that my PIC, you can't necessarily just throw the remainder of it into SIC, because there may have been planes that you flew, T6 or any T-37, good examples, right? They are certified for solo operation. It's not necessarily a plane that requires more than one pilot to fly. So do a lot of people use that as SIC time? I would argue that they do, and I think a lot of airlines are okay with that. If they want to be sticklers, though, or if the FAA wants to be a stickler, legally you should not be doing that. You should not log SIC time unless it's an aircraft that requires more than one pilot to be in there. So that's one area where it's a good example that you can't just automatically throw all the remainder time into SIC. Another good example, the Air Force has other time. So there is no physical definition for what other time is in the CFR. They don't really recognize it at all. You're self-loading baggage. Why would I log time, for you at all? So what we do at MilKEEP is we have a secondary column called civilian other, and that's where it would equate in that sense. But if you can remember from a conversation that we had earlier, I think it was Mike was talking about, did you sign for the aircraft? If you did, I would consider the fact that you are responsible for that plane at all times, whether you're sitting at a set of flight controls, whether you're jump seating and giving an evaluation, or whether you're heating a burrito in the oven. You're still responsible for that plane. You signed for it, so you have the ability to log PIC time. So some people choose to do that. Some people who have a whole lot of time will choose to take it out completely, and then that's another argument that they can make when they're justifying their logbooks to airlines, saying, look, I was even more conservative. I used a very low percentage. I didn't count any of my other time towards PIC, and yet I still have the preferred number of hours. So that's a good way to be conservative if you have the time, and it's a good way to not pad your numbers, but to justify using other time as PIC if you're a little bit lower. Instructor and evaluator time. So you can see the 14 CFR. You can log it for pilot in command for all flight time while serving as an authorized instructor. So in the Air Force, what makes it nice and clean and easy is 100% of your IP time and your EP time bundle that as civilian instructor time, and 100% of that can count as PIC time. Some people like to do the percentage for that as well to try to be more conservative, and that's fine. Issues with all of these when you're taking percentages and then moving things into different categories, issues that you might see when you start getting into, and we'll talk about it with airline apps and pilot credentials, is they don't all add up to a specific total number, which is something that we're used to seeing in the military, and just logically you're going to look at it and say, why don't these things add up? So things to take into consideration when you're deciding how you're going to actually calculate PIC time and your SIC time. Slide. So Army and Navy guys, do we still have guys in here? I got an Army. All right, so, and this is just good education for the Air Force side of the house. So on the top is a snapshot of a pull out from the SHARP database. So you can see they actually have a column for aircraft commander time, which is pretty good. So a lot of the times prior to your aircraft commander certification date, all that's going to be blank, and you're going to have logged, I think they use co-pilot time and first pilot time. And then they also have special aircrew time, which is kind of analogous to other time. You're basically not sitting behind a set of flight controls. But you can easily see from the SHARP records, if I was the aircraft commander and I was logging aircraft commander time, then I can probably use the rest of that time that I logged during the entirety of that sortie for PIC. So they're a little bit luckier. Army's even luckier. They just have straight up duty positions where I was certified as an aircraft commander, and they look at me, and when I ask questions like, you guys have enough ACs that you can put more than one on a plane? Like, what's wrong with you? So they have, hey, if I have this duty position certification, boom, I get 100% of the time. One issue that they do have with the CAPERS database that a lot of our users asked us to build into this was, you notice that for the Navy, they have one line. They log all their different types of time on one line. It's one sortie. In the Air Force, same exact thing. If you go back to the IFRR, all of your times are logged on one thing. You can say, like, I flew more than one sortie on one line, but everything is designated in one line. When you go to a CAPERS poll, for some reason, they have some poor soul typing in the same exact flight more than once. So you can see, like, 19 February for this guy. The guy flew a 60. But it's the same flight time, same end time. Typically, they'll have the same locations to and from. So it's an identical flight, but under the FS ID, flight station ID, so that's like the condition that they're flying. H stands for hood, which is simulated instrument, D is for day, but every single condition, they're logging multiple lines for that. So you can't just count how many lines are in my thing and call it that many sorties, because these need to be condensed into a specific sortie type. So for Army users doing CAFERS, it's easy for the aircraft commander section, like what my duty position was, to identify if I was the PIC or not. But when you have to go into something which a lot of Army like to talk about as the conversion factor for taxi time, something that's very important that you have to take into account when you're doing that conversion is how many sorties did you fly. So you can't just take the entirety of every single line, call it that many sorties, and then go to town and nail it by 0.3. You have to actually condense everything into one flight for one sortie. So, slide. All right, so the stuff that we really care about, I'm going to try to dodge spears. Hopefully there aren't a ton of questions based on the ones that Mike and Jess got. This will be interesting. So, two major application websites for all the major carriers. Pilot Credentials carries it for FedEx, Southwest, and American, and a bunch of the regionals. The way that they have it set up, there is no total time block, so they do all the totalizations for you. You don't have to worry about inputting a total time. So when we get into the next example, you don't have to worry about making it all add up in this one. But it has a PIC column, right, easy. It has an SIC column. In that, I think Charlie brought this one up. So on this column for SIC, since there is no dual or student column, then you're going to insert that time from pilot training or any time that you were an unqualified pilot. Anytime you had just dual time, you'll roll that into SIC. Instructor here is going to be equal to both your IP and your EP time combined, evaluator time. And as Jess was saying, you're going to include your instructor time in your PIC. So if I have 1,500 total hours of PIC, but 500 of it was instructor time, you're still going to have 1,500, and then you're going to say 500 for your instructor, which differs from the other site. Also, you're going to notice there is no other time block. What we recommend, if you do decide to use some of the other time as PIC, you just call that straight PIC. If you have, I don't know what I call other, right? Other time when you were a co-pilot and it wasn't PIC time, leave that off and don't count it at all when you're doing stuff for pilot credentials or the airlines associated with them. Slide. So to make things more difficult, airlineapps.com decided to do things a little bit differently. They're in charge of Delta, United, and a whole bunch of regionals as well. So here's an example of the breakout and how they like to calculate their times. But in this scenario, you want to make sure that your PIC, SIC, instructor, dual, and other time all add up to something. It's a much easier verification process to look at. So here, the instructor column that they have, you also want to have IP time and EP time. You want to separate out the instructor time from the PIC. So that's completely different from the pilot credentials site. So if I had, in the last scenario, right, if I had 1,500 hours of PIC and 500 of it was instructor, now what I'm going to put here is, I shouldn't have said that because now I'm using a bad example, but so you put it separately. You would have 1,000 and 500, and that system will add it up together, if that makes sense. Other time, when I just talked about non-PIC, other time, that's what you would put into that block. Don't put the total of other that you were also using as PIC. You don't want to dual count things, if that makes sense. You want to make sure that everything is separate, everything has its place, and at the end of the day, everything will add up to one. They also say don't include any RPA, UAV time, or whatever the unmanned term is of the day. Let's go. Slide. All right, so key takeaways for this one before we start getting into questions. Obviously, the services did not help us out at all when they decided to create all the ways that they're going to log flight time. And one of the big questions we get is how come they didn't do this so that it's exactly like the FAA? And the only thing I can think of when I get back to it is like, would I really want to help you get to the airlines faster? Like, I probably want to make it as difficult as possible. But I would say, argue and based on everyone's kind of description of their previous time, I don't think we've done ourselves a whole lot of service either. Because if we go do the annual flight record review, you're like, yep, that looks good, and then 15 years later, when you're typing everything in, nothing seems to make sense, right? So, I guess I'm talking to the people who are getting out in 2 years, but go back to your squadrons and tell everybody, guys, you should really start a logbook from day one, because there's a huge difference between PIC and primary time, SIC, secondary time, and it'll really help you in the long run. CFR has no written guidance on how to do a specific military to civilian transition. It just straight doesn't. So really everything is based off of preferences from the airlines, blogs, what other people do in Excel spreadsheets, which are sometimes great and sometimes really hard to follow based on the logic that person is doing. So the big takeaway from that is because the CFR doesn't say this is exactly how primary and secondary time translate into PIC and SIC, because that doesn't exist, there is more than one acceptable way to create a civilian logbook. I guess my caveat to that obviously is some will definitely come under more scrutiny than others. If you have something that is much more conservative, something that adds up to a total time, and something that just looks logical, then that will probably pass the sniff check 90% of the time. You can certainly make a case where there are instances that you could dual log time. For example, if I'm unqualified co-pilot or something like that, and I'm being instructed in an upgrade, yet I have been qualified in that plane before, and I want to log SIC time as well as dual time, you can kind of make that argument. If I'm instructing and I want to log IP time but also call it PIC time in my civilian logbook so that things are broken out the way Pilot Credentials does it, you can make an argument for that. As long as you know as long as you're comfortable articulating the way that you did the conversions that you're presenting, then you're going to be fine. But just so you know, there are easier ways to do it, and there's ways that will have less scrutiny when you go into applications. There's certainly other ways that you can do it, where if you want to walk into a FBO, and have an argument with a FSDO on a rainy day, like you can certainly have those as well. There's a lot of leeway in the CFR. Slide. I think that might be the get off the stage for me in terms of explaining stuff. But I was looking forward to this kind of being a discussion, having questions about this, and I know a lot of good questions came to Mike and Jess in terms of what you guys are thinking about for logbooks and conversions. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to happy to take them now. Yeah.
For airline apps, what about time that you are an instructor
Go back a couple.
but not a PIC?
Yeah, good question. So because, scroll back a couple, the CFR definition of instructor time says anytime that you are serving as an authorized instructor, you may log pilot and command time. And because Airline Apps likes to have it line up so that everything adds up, and it's just recommended that you use it put it in the instructor block. They're going to do the math for you and make it PIC, basically.
So anytime my line says, hey, I have IP on that line, put it in that block, whether I was a PIC or not.
So if you can go back to the slide, there you go. So if your question is anytime it says IP here, I would say no. It would say anytime you logged INST, like instructor time. So any of that and anything in the evaluator column, I would say lump that into the civilian instructor, and the system will automatically count that as PIC for you.
And then do you add 0.3 to your IP hours?
So I recommend do not. So a lot of the airlines like to do their own on the side. So yeah, Charlie.
Only one airline wants you to use a 0.3 conversion, and that's Southwest. Everybody else wants raw data and has their own formulas for converting your raw data flight time to what they want to use it.
It's 0.3 per sortie, not per hour.
Correct. Per sortie and yeah.
So the Army likes to complicate things even more. How would you log UT, unit training time, for the Army pilots that don't go to just a formalized instructor pilot course?
Yeah, that haven't gone to the course. So so we've got a thing in the back, a little decoder ring, and I'll talk to you back about that one. Yeah, because I'm not. We just released Army, so I'm still getting the reps in. Yes.
So for a block on an app that says civilian instructor time, if you got your military equivalency, would you put in your instructor time since you got that equivalency in the military in that time, or would you just leave it as 0? You haven't done any actual.
So I would if it's time, if you were a military certified instructor and they're asking for civilian instructor time from airlineapps.com or from a different.
App it was on, but I remember the block.
It's American and FedEx only for that particular question. And if you're doing military instructor time, it's not civilian instructor time.
Okay.
Yes.
So day-to-day, we don't really ever use the word sorting. So if I fly an out and in, and at the far place, I land, I taxi, I stop, I do whatever, that's 2 sorties, right?
True statement. That one was easy. Yeah.
And just to be clear, like simulator time, even the school motion does not count, right?
That's correct. There are no Air Force certified simulators, like FAA certified, that you'd be able to use. So no. Yep. No, we capture those. Small plug for MilKEEP, right? We capture everything for you, but it breaks out what are actual manned aircraft, what's unmanned aircraft, and what's a simulator. So you'll still have that information in the cloud, but it will not get thrown into the totals when you're doing all that stuff. Yeah.
Americans got some crazy stuff like cross country, and also I think what you break out your sorties by instructor sorties. So
Yep.
I guess my question is, does your system do that for us?
We
If not, if we want to do it on our own, what do you most?
So we do break out cross-country time. I think the definition of cross-country time for military is like 50 nautical miles, I believe, is the minimum. So we took into account, if you go into our FAQs, we give an answer for that. But basically, if you're assuming that you're under 10,000 feet going 250 knots, anything, if you log time that's more than 1 hour on that particular sortie, we credit that, because that gives you 4 times the amount of coverage that you would have flown on a normal cross-country. So in our system, we take into account, if you take off and do like a 0.5 or something like that, it won't count. But once you're above a 1.0, it gives you cross-country time for that.
This is a lead question,
Absolutely.
but, can you explain to everybody a little bit about kind of the technological, what your system does, and then the magic that it's making happen?
Yeah, so I think
It's impressive.
the big bang for what MilKEEP does, we use something called optical character recognition, which will take, I think everyone has had not everyone, hopefully, from this point on, but a lot of us in this room have the horror story of when they had to sit in front of an Excel spreadsheet and manually type in every single one of their cells of data, right? So, Kim and I sat down for like 2 straight days to input 15 years of my stuff, and at first I just said, hey, Google, I'll just Google it. Somebody has to do this, right? And all I got were blogs of people yelling at, why hasn't someone created this yet, right? So we decided to go ahead and do it. And it's worked out really well. But what it does, it takes your PDF, you upload it, and then through optical character recognition, it parses out every single one of these, and then we have running in the background, we have algorithms that do sanity checks for things. So a lot of the things that we find, like we processed one last night, and this is, I would say, with 98-ish% of our customers, we've only had like maybe 2 that haven't had this. Duplicates that exist, possible duplicates that are still in there that the SARM has not caught and Z'd out. So when people say, I don't know, I don't need to do any of this stuff, I'm just going to plop my green folder down, I'm going to give my summary page, and I'm good to go. And hey, in a lot of instances, I guess you could do that, and people have certainly been hired that way. But if you wanted to dig or just scratch for a second and ask to add up everything that was in your individual lines, based on what we've seen, there's a 98% chance that there's extra sorties that if you added those all up, they're not going to match what's in your summary page. So that's one of the things that we end up catching. We have 11401 rules built in there, so we'll see a lot of times that, for instance, the total time is equal to 6, but they logged 7.5 hours of combat time, and it's like, hey, you can't do that. Or it logged a 0 for the sortie and never gave you credit for a sortie. And we're like, hey, you have a 0 logged as a sortie. That's kind of a big one that we catch all the time. So I think the big bang for the buck is instead of sitting in front of Excel for 2 days, you get a product within typically a matter of hours. We guarantee 48 hours, but you get it almost instantly. And then it also gives you sanity checks on all the things that the SARM missed and that they miscalculated and allowed to go through when the 11401 shouldn't have allowed you to log it that way.
Does your system create its own summary page?
It does, yeah. So with MilKEEP, you'll get your entire military logbook in the cloud in perpetuity. You'll get a civilian logbook based off of your preferences. So if you do or do not want to count other time, you can use that. It has a slide ruler percentage if you want to do that. For instance, one of my deployments was I knew for a fact that I was the aircraft commander on all 120 days of that deployment. We have a block where you can legitimately say I was the A code on these sorties, and that will go 100% to PIC, and it won't use the percentage tool that you select.
So you've had guys go to airline interviews, walk down in front of the review board, nothing but a product that's yours, and they say that's fine.
So
they don't like, why don't you have this Air Force looking junky thing?
So we know for a fact that customers that we have been hired by every single major airline, and we stopped counting the regionals, but yeah, almost every major regional, we have never had somebody come back and say,
They wanted the green folder instead of what you had.
yeah, no, absolutely not. No, they didn't want that. Yep. Now, you'll see in blogs and stuff, they're like, I went in with my green folder and I was good to go. And, good, more power to you. But
Technology, I would assume, breaks out different aircraft types.
absolutely, yep.
And if I wanted to call multiple aircraft variants as one variant, i.e. C-130,
Mhm.
24 different variants,
Yep.
I want most all of them to be just C-130, others be C-130J. I'm only going to break it out
Into 2. So if you want to do that, so what it'll do is it will take E models, H models, J models, and all that kind of stuff. So it'll break them out completely separately for you. If you call us and tell us ahead of time, hey, that's how I want it to look, we can do that before it goes into the system. We can technically do it afterwards too. It's just a little bit more legwork. What the system does is it gives you exactly what was logged, right or wrong. And so a lot of those will say, for instance, before when we said, you logged 7 hours of total time, but 8 hours of combat time, we leave it in there because that is how it was logged by the SARM, but we send you a personal note at the end saying, hey, your logbook's ready, here are some of the discrepancies we found, and then, feel free to make any changes that you want.
If we have a civilian electronic logbook, will you pair the two against each other?
So we are, right now it's for logging military flights that convert into civilian. We are we are working towards that. I don't want to make any promises, but yeah, we're working to the point like, hey, I flew Cessnas on the side or something.
No, this would be, I have a logbook that I kept of my military flights,
Mm-hmm.
and then I have the green folder too. Are they gonna be compared against each other, and I could, like if one's missing from record, I could.
So if you, yeah, absolutely. If you give us your green folder, we'll create something, and then you can compare and contrast the two. Yeah. Anyone else? Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And if you have any other questions regarding your specific logbook or specific instance, we'll be out there. Please let us know. We'll be happy to talk.